This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Canna Health.
Hey cannabis consumers, have you ever consumed a cannabis product thinking it'll make you feel a certain way, but then it doesn't? Don't you wish you had a clear understanding of your own DNA so that you could make informed decisions about what type of cannabis products interact best with your system? Well, now you can with EndoDNA. EndoDNA is a simple DNA test that maps your entire endocannabinoid system and then matches that summary with a specific cannabinoid ratio and terpene profile that best aligns with your unique genotype. Imagine being armed with personal information when visiting a dispensary. You'll have the knowledge and power and capability to purchase products that best align with your genotype. Visit their website to purchase the EndoDNA Collection Kit and Endo Decoded Report at endodna.com/products and use the promo code CONNECT15 for a 20% discount. Again, that's endodna.com/products and use the promo code CONNECT15 for a 20% discount. The future of cannabinoid therapeutics is here with EndoDNA. Bethany Gomez, how are you?
Great, Kevin. How are you?
I am doing well this evening. Thank you for asking. I'm very excited to be talking to you today. I know your role within Brightfield Group, which is managing director and co-founder. You're hyper focused on data insights and how it relates to the CBD cannabis and wellness industries. Is that right?
Absolutely. Spot on.
Yes, it's leading with insights. That's what we need, I feel like. And that's really, where the world is today, right? Data informs everything. So I guess at a high level, before we jump into more specific details about your role, why don't you tell us a little bit about, data insights from your perspective and why they are so important currently in this burgeoning industry?
Yeah. Well, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. Why is data important in this burgeoning industry, in here? And really, I think as cannabis starts to scale up, it is becoming more and more important for companies to have real strong business strategies behind them. This is evolving into a consumer packaged goods industry. Companies need to know who the consumer is. What do they actually want out of their products? Need to be able to develop product branding expansion strategies that are really focused on those consumers and putting those consumers at the heart of it. And early on in this industry, and I've been involved in this industry for many years now at this point, and in those early days, many companies were just expecting that they were if they were first movers in the space, that they were really going to be able to just grow and explode and be able to capture the full industry. And what we find is when you're looking at companies and their performance in there, you can't just grab a piece of it and grab on and kind of stake your claim and expect to be able to grow. Even though the market continues to grow year over year over year, that doesn't mean that anybody who is in here first is going to be successful. So now companies really have to apply those same really strong business fundamentals to be strategic, to develop a strong strategy, to understand their consumers and really know what they're doing in here, and can't just go on instinct or hope that the growth of the industry is going to carry them. It's too competitive. You can't win that way.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like what you're describing there is really like that transition period from illicit market to now legal operating industry, right? Given in adult use states. Is that what you mean in some sense? Because what I mean by that is more of the business savvy that maybe some of these legacy operators are missing.
Yeah, so we first started Brightfield and launched in 2015. So those were very early days. There were still, the first adult use markets, some of the first medical markets, developing, but there wasn't a lot of competition at that point. There was a lot of very small companies, that were operating in the space. And when cannabis goes from being illicit to being legal, and you're the only game in town, it's, while it's challenging to navigate the environment in and be that pioneer, your business strategy doesn't necessarily need to be as refined. You don't necessarily need to have, the world's greatest marketing, plan to be able to sell cannabis.
Right.
But really, and even as companies first open up their doors in an adult use market, those initial stage operations are really just a focus on getting a product on shelf, right? A product that's not bad on shelf in there. And there's usually so much supply shortage that just getting a product on shelf in the very early days is good enough and you'll sell through. What we're getting into right now is this next chapter in many of the emerging, cannabis markets, both, on the West Coast, in the Midwest, in the Northeast, some of these more established markets, same up in Canada. We're past that first chapter of just getting something open, just getting a market open, and getting into this chapter of having to have a refined business strategy and being able to actually scale and compete and win against your competitors, win over those consumers, and build that long-term strategy.
That makes sense. Because what I was describing was early days. So it sounds like we're in phase 2 now, where as more of these more mature markets are coming online, it's not just getting that product on the shelf. It's like you said, a refined business strategy, a solid marketing plan, probably go-to-market strategy, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of insights, I think that's a good kind of, I guess, starting point for this conversation is I went ahead and gave Brightfield Group my email so that I'm on your newsletter list for the
That's great.
US CBD market industry update, the report. So what I want to do is share my screen. I won't stay too long on it. I just wanted to kind of have you at a high level, maybe talk about some of the insights that came from it.
Sure.
And then, for those listening or watching, you can, of course, get the report by subscribing as well. But here we go. Introduction and overview. I mean, what were kind of some of the main takeaways from the US CBD market industry update report?
Yeah, so CBD, it's been a challenging year in 2021 for the CBD space. If you're familiar with CBD, it was a rocket ship in 2019 as it exploded. It kind of got rattled by the pandemic. And then in 2021, there was a lot of a holding pattern. Both companies in the space were really looking to, be able to kind of wait out the industry to some extent, hoping that the bottom would fall out of the competitive landscape, so that there would be, at the height, there was more than 3,500 CBD brands operating in the space. By the close of 2020, there was about 2,000. From a high level standpoint, we saw a lot of brands drop out of the industry, and at the end of 2020. In 2021, there were a lot more stagnation. Not as many brands dropped out. We also didn't see any real movement from the FDA. So that kind of distribution, landscape is still really stagnant in there. And, we had, so there was a lot of a holding pattern. Right now, what we're seeing is some brands really focus on outperforming the market. Some brands are really focusing on being able to develop this kind of overlap and expansion outside of the category, while consumers, continue to use CBD and continue to, adopt, and actually more of them are using CBD, but they're trading down to, lower price point options, particularly gummies, and to a lesser extent drinks. So there's a lot of brands that are outperforming the category, but there's a lot of kind of challenges in the industry right now as well. So a lot of focus on that, outperforming the industry there.
Got you. And gummies, why? I mean, that's interesting, right? I see edibles as being a category that I guess is more accessible, I guess, and more approachable for a first-time user, right, or consumer. So is that kind of what that insight is telling you, that maybe it's just a bit more applicable to someone who's just getting started in this industry?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. Edibles, gummies in general are a very approachable product format. That's how people use their vitamins. That's how they're, using what they're flocking to from the cannabis side of things as well. So it's an approachable way to consume something that's like a supplement in there. And those are becoming more, proliferating more. Previously, CBD had been dominated by tinctures, which are kind of objectively a bit of a weird product in there. Who wants to take their vitamin with an eyedropper? But you don't really see them anywhere outside of the category in there. But so the form factor is very comfortable with gummies. They're also cheaper. So they have a tendency of being kind of a lower price point option. And in the world at large right now, or in Canada, in the US right now, with inflation being as high as it is, consumers are very price sensitive and are looking for ways to be able to kind of control, their overall cost and their kind of budgets.
Mhm.
That makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And it leads me kind of to my next question. And you've touched on it in your answer, covering, some of the highlights from the report. And that is, taking more of a deeper dive into the perspectives from both the consumer perspective and the market perspective as it relates to cannabis and CBD wellness industries. So, from the market perspective, at least in my view, it seems like there is just so much product out there. And what I mean by is like flower, right? There's a lot of hemp that's been grown and just hasn't been sold, at least I know in Texas and of course in other states. So can you explain why that is, and what maybe, if you have a crystal ball from a market perspective, where it goes from here?
Yeah, it's a great question. With the market, when 2019 first hit, everyone went out and put plants in the ground, right? And there was a massive push for everyone who thought they could make a buck on it, to put plants in the ground. And it was designed to be able to, the farm bill that allowed for CBD and hemp was designed to allow for this to be a benefit for farmers. And the costs and the prices they were able to levy for it at the time they put plants in the ground were very, very high. Of course, supply and demand, it happens. And, this is kind of econ 101. More people are going to keep planting until nobody makes any money off of it. And then, people stop planting, and then you'll end up with kind of an equilibrium in the market. So, we still have a bit of an oversupply, which has dropped the commodity prices. The commodity prices dropping has actually been a really good thing for consumers, which will allow those price points to be able to come down and be able to pass on that savings that will, help to continue drive adoption, in the industry. But it does mean that, there is, this continued downward price pressure, on the market to kind of align with the, with kind of the volume stagnation or volume growth, lower volume growth in there, which leads to kind of more of a flat aspect of the market. So, at this point, what we're really looking at, is, pricing with inflation climbing in all other products. It's very weird to talk about in, CBD, and even in cannabis, prices generally going down overall, as
Right.
kind of prices, have, normalized or kind of gotten closer to, their supplement counterparts. And there, we would assume that at some juncture in here that downward dip in pricing is going to kind of bottom out in there, and we'll be able to see some more growth in the category. Furthermore, of course, everyone continues to wait for, the FDA or additional regulations, to be able to cause an additional boom in distribution and adoption in the space. But unfortunately, at this point, because that has delayed for so long, it's really kind of sucked a lot of the wind out of the category at this juncture. So
Yeah. It's so interesting that you say that about how like your point about inflation and
Mhm.
then prices going down on the CBD product side. But it's just, to me, in the back of in my mind, I'm thinking another win for consumers when it comes to, the cannabis CBD industry, and it being like pandemic proof, disaster proof in some ways, where it's accessible, it's good. And I'm surprised. I think I heard you say that there's a volume. The volume is not growing as of right now, even with the prices dropping. Is that correct?
Well, we are seeing some level of volume growth, in the CBD space. It's more tempered than it used to be, right? So we aren't seeing as many new consumers come into the category, but we are seeing essentially a light level of volume growth with kind of depressed prices, and their declined prices versus what we'd seen previously. So, 2021, we actually saw the market contract in the CBD space. So that was kind of the first time that had happened. We do expect to see more growth, in 2022, and here partially, with that contraction in pricing starting to ease, but also with, more openings related to COVID restrictions easing and things like that. Hopefully some additional, movement from the FDA, but again, that does not seem terribly imminent, at the moment. So,
Right. Yeah. I mean,
mhm.
we're waiting for FDA on all kinds of different things, right? I mean, in terms of like guidance for marketing and sales messaging, right? Like there's still so much censorship when it comes to cannabis and CBD products as well. Even hemp products are
Yeah.
susceptible to that, which is it's just crazy at this point. Yeah. I want to ask you about current trends that you're seeing. So you mentioned gummies being one. I mean, is there any other trends that stand out that are worth noting?
Yeah, so CBD and CBD in particular, drinks are also getting a significant boost, at the moment. And this is being driven both from kind of that consumer lens as well as, from a supply lens as well. So, last year there was some partnerships inked with brands such as Center and Recess, with large alcohol distributors that allowed them to kind of get their products out into a larger array of stores through these independents, that can help to drive some additional eyes and additional volume, more products on shelves at C stores. It also just aligns with this overall, larger trends that we're seeing in the wellness space, around consumers looking to reduce their alcohol consumption or swap out, alcohol for, more non-alcoholic alternatives, or more of kind of sober products. Also kind of aligning with some of those consumer trends on functional ingredients and relaxation and sleep-based, products as well. So it really kind of is what we see in CBD is kind of tying into this larger trends in the wellness space as well. And CBD's had a bit of an identity crisis. It used to consider itself a kind of a full-on industry, and to some extent it still does. But, CBD's kind of at this juncture also considering themselves part of the larger wellness space and part of the larger, cannabis space, depending on who you talk to. So those trends around functional ingredients and adaptogens and, need state-based positionings really aligns with what we see in kind of the mainstream functional beverage space and, some of the mainstream supplement space as well.
Mm-hmm. You just answered. That was going to be my next question. I mean, you coined that phrase, the identity crisis, right? But I mean, it's true. Like I was going to ask you, it seems like CBD is gravitating toward wellness. I mean, even in my personal use of CBD, I'm not smoking CBD flower, right? I'm using CBD ointment on my joints, or like you said, I'm having a CBD beverage to relax, maybe alleviate some anxiety that I may be having, and maybe inflammation with, like I said, with the rubs and whatnot. So that really
Yeah.
does make sense.
Yeah. It's interesting though. CBD's kind of split, it's a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Sure.
And, on the one side of it, you have this, all of what you're saying right now of kind of the relaxation of, pain relief of kind of, the topicals, the creams, the daily supplement gummies on that side of things. But then
Coffee,
you have
even
this whole
coffee. Yeah. In your coffees.
coffees, all sorts of, these kind of adjacent, more wellness, CPG, types of categories. But then on the other side of it, we also have this whole adjacency to the cannabis space and to kind of the smoke and vape shop world, or the tobacco category as well, which has really given rise to, the explosion through 2021 of, Delta 8 products or Delta 10 products or THCO products, and, these CBD products that also have more of the kind of THC or buzz, type positioning in there as well. So there's that whole side of things as well, which I would hesitate to call wellness based off of the branding or positioning of many of the brands in there. That's not necessarily what they're targeting, but it's more of kind of an adjacent positioning to, the adult use cannabis space.
Right. No, that makes sense. In fact, Amos Lozano, shout out to Amos. He's in Texas, in San Antonio, and he actually smokes nothing but CBD joints. Like it's his alternative, right? Because he doesn't want that head buzz. I mean, I'm going off of what I've seen on his social media, and he seems to prefer it, and it works for him. So I totally get that. And not to mention what the CBD market is doing in terms of like the opening up the doors for the other minor cannabinoids, right?
Yeah.
Like CBN, like you mentioned, for sleep, and CBG, right? CBG is the mother cannabinoid, and what is that usually used for? Or
so we think of it as like the skin cannabinoid, right? It's good for inflammation. It's good for kind of topicals. There's a lot of applications from that lens. Frankly, CBG needs some good marketing and branding focus on it, because it isn't, to your point, that's the question. There's CBN, it's for sleep. There's CBG, it's for something.
I just know it's the mother cannabinoid, and without
mother cannabinoid is for something.
Right? Like you wouldn't have THC or CBD without it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there are opportunities, and the awareness around CBN and CBG has grown, and the usage rates on those have grown. I think there's still a bit of a lack of understanding on some of those. And I think there has been, a fair amount of more discussion about them than consumer adoption on them. Last year we saw a lot of products released with CBN or CBG, included in them, and got a little bit of traction and a little bit of fanfare. Everybody kind of rolled them out at the same time in there. The CBG products never really kind of took over or got a lot of media attention, or kind of, went really mainstream in there. CBN products they do have a lot of really great applications in like topicals and skincare, in particular. But kind of the mainstream tinctures, haven't really crusted yet in there. And, CBN products have been developed with product formulations that also include melatonin and are, positioned for sleep, by incorporating melatonin in them and CBN. With the melatonin inclusion, you can essentially piggyback off of those claims and be able to position a product for sleep, which has been a very effective kind of combination for a lot of, CBD brands. So
gotcha. Yep.
Well, we do see that creeping into the THC side of things as well, too, in the regulated cannabis, more CBN products, incorporated, and, CBN to THC ratios and things like that as well. So I think there's some exciting innovation on that side of things as well.
Sure. And you bring up a really good point as we wrap up the branding identity part of this discussion. And that's at some point, we're not going to be calling it the CBD market, right? I mean, it's going to be the minor cannabinoid market, because are we going to start to say the CBN market, the CBG market, the THC market? I mean, like you said, there's overlap with CBN and THC now. So terminology, I think, is very important as we continue to talk about this stuff and educate, right? Is to kind of, but I mean, obviously that's difficult too, because consumers can take off with what they know as well. So it's like you can't control what the consumers do. So it's a catch 22, I guess, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I think there may be an evolution into both CBD and, and the minor cannabinoids into the larger functional ingredient space and the larger kind of cannabis space in there. Because, when you start to layer in, when it was just CBD, That was one thing. When it was CBD and CBN and CBG, and CBN and CBG are really kind of coupled in with the CBD positioning, just from a regulatory standpoint, they're, very similar. That makes sense to keep them all together. When you start layering in cannabinoids like Delta 8 in there and Delta 10 and THCO and these types of things, then that kind of changes the conversation a little bit to be more of this larger cannabinoid, focus, or the larger products derived from the cannabis plant, right? And, being able to kind of segment some of those out. So at Brightfield, we still have our kind of cannabis or, THC regulated, market side of things, and, the CBD side of things. And that's our terminology, and we're sticking with it for the moment in here, but I'll let you know if we ever change them.
Well, it's definitely going to change at some point. But yes, I feel you. We got to start slow. CBD is familiar. It's something that everybody's talking about. And as we learn more about the minor cannabinoids, I'm sure that that terminology will surface and people will be familiar with it as well. Switching gears, we started the conversation with data and the importance of data insights to inform decisions.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go back to data, and we're in 2022. We know that data is the new gold, right? And so how can companies, in your view, leverage data insights to keep a more competitive edge and stay ahead within the market?
The biggest thing, the two biggest things I would say, are companies need to actually have a consumer-driven brand strategy, right? You should not be guessing who your consumer is. You should not be producing a brand that is just targeting yourself, or kind of expecting your consumer to look just like you. In this competitive market, in this kind of next phase of cannabis, you need to really understand what segment of the market you're going after and what those consumers want. You need to be able to have a more, developed strategy. So understanding the changing face of, the cannabis consumer is increasingly important, because you can't just, guess on it and hope you're going to be right, because your competitors are doing that. Your competitors are developing sophisticated branding strategies, and those that are not doing that are getting kind of pummeled, right?
Mm-hmm.
On that second note is actually paying attention to and creating a data-driven product development strategy is also very important. There's far too often that companies have lost millions and millions and millions of dollars in time and kind of trajectory here, just by kind of guessing on what they think the market is going to do. And if you're guessing wrong, or you're just following what's already out there on the space, that's also one of the biggest things that we hear from people, like, well, I kind of track what's already out there. You're like, great. Then if you develop your product based off of something that somebody else launched 6 months ago, you're already behind. By the time you bring a product to market, now you're a year behind the trend in here, and you don't actually know where the market is going. Nobody gets into cannabis for what has happened before. You need to actually be forward looking to stay ahead of the market and build the category in there. And you need to be able to leverage data and understand your consumer and understand your product and brand strategy to be able to do so.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really good advice. And I mean, of course, Brightfield Group, I mean, that's your bread and butter in terms of generating these insights and informing these companies regarding the trends, so that they can stay ahead in terms of their marketing and sales plans for any given year. If there's companies that are just starting out, right, they're bootstrapping, I mean, what are some kind of basic steps that they could do to start obtaining these insights to inform their strategy?
Yeah, well, and not to be too self-promotional, but we do work with companies small and large, across the spectrum in here. And, we do work with small companies that can just pick your consumer data and understand your consumer market, right? Understand kind of this segment and what it is, and build a strategy around strong data. I talk to so many small brands that are, yes, they're bootstrapping, they're cash strapped. they, maybe a drinks brand that thinks they're targeting, occasional use moms, and isn't realizing that they don't go into dispensaries, and that's not who the consumer is right now. So you're going to have a very serious problem getting your product to scale if you think you're targeting this market that isn't there, right? That isn't kind of walking in. Having a small amount of data in a limited package to start out with, will give you at least the foundations to give you a fighting chance in here to be able to build a brand around and a product that is going to kind of meet the market and be able to connect with what the consumer is, while finding a little bit of white space in there. So starting small, don't feel like you have to boil the ocean, don't feel like you have to kind of get the largest, brand package or, data package in the world, but at least know who your consumer is and make sure that package aligns with where there's an opportunity, that positioning lines up with where there's opportunity in the market.
That is such great advice. I say that because there's so often you see small business owners, first-time entrepreneurs, they're building out their business plan, they're building out their marketing and sales strategy, and they've painted this picture of their desired end consumer or their end customer, right? And this is who I'm going to market to. I'm going to base all my marketing to target this particular person, this type of person, right? This demographic. And like you said, they didn't start with data insights. They just kind of went with what they envisioned they wanted. And they soon realized, once they've gone to market, okay, wait, I need to rethink my strategy here, because first off, my demographic's not even on these channels, right? Or that demographic doesn't exist right now. They're not the majority at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are very expensive mistakes, right? Those are very expensive mistakes to make. So, we're a startup, we work with a lot of startups. Really, all of the cannabis companies in the space are only a few years out from having been startups themselves, in here. But, having being really smart and intentional about it, you're coming into a crowded category, right? These are crowded categories with a lot of players in them, and you got to outperform them. So, come with a strategy. It's important.
Start with a strategy, come with a strategy, and utilize the data.
As a driven strategy. Let's put it that way.
That's right. Well, speaking of data-driven strategy, let's talk about data and trends in the US compared to Canada.
Yeah. Really interesting topic, really, really interesting topic. And, in the US, over one thing I found really fascinating is when the pandemic hit in the US, we saw the average consumer and actually shift female. Really kind of what we've seen overall and, in cannabis over the past few years here is, as more and more states open up, cannabis stigma is dropping, cannabis usage is rising. We found over the last 6 months, 18% of American adults, 21 plus, had purchased cannabis in the past 6 months. So 18%, that's a huge amount, right? Especially considering half our country still lives in prohibition, in here. So that number is growing. And, the different consumer segments that are using cannabis are continuing to grow and shift as well. As soon as pandemic hit, in especially these new Midwestern, and Eastern states where cannabis became more normalized, we saw that average consumer shift female in Illinois and Michigan and many other, states around the country. And here, pandemic's been kind of rough on the ladies, and you need some cannabis to get through Zoom school, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, we also seen, just some radical transformations in particularly those Gen Z women, too. The moms, there's definitely a strong segment of gummy using moms, that are kind of growing up in that are emerging in the space. But Gen Z consumers, Gen Z women in particular, are overwhelmingly flocking to cannabis, overwhelmingly flocking to kind of vapes, flower. Many of them are choosing, to abstain from alcohol and, choose more of that Cali sober, lifestyle in here. But it's a really kind of radical, shift and, and really interesting long-term indicator of where both cannabis and alcohol markets may be going, but that I digress. And there, also interesting trends we found in Q1 and Q2 of 2021. The number of baby boomers who had purchased cannabis in the past 6 months spiked up. Basically, all the baby boomers got their vaccines and went straight to the dispensary, which I think is awesome. Definitely shifting.
It's so funny. Yeah, no, it's funny. I mean, my dad, like, he doesn't do it regularly, but just the other day I talked to him and he's like, oh, I went outside and puffed on a little, and I'm like, because it's legal in New Mexico now, and it's like,
Yeah.
it's so amazing to see the shift in like the personality, because you've never seen your loved one do that before, right? Until now, when
Yeah,
it's becoming more normalized. And your
it
points
is.
about those trends are so interesting. I mean, the female adoption makes so much sense, and I've said it on the podcast previously. I've had guests on that have talked about this trend in particular as well, and I
Mhm.
mean, it makes so much sense because of the therapeutic benefits that come from
Yeah.
cannabis use,
Mhm.
especially for women, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And what's really interesting also is, once new consumers get into get into using cannabis, they also end up shifting fairly quickly into being kind of daily or multiple times a day users. So more than 60% of cannabis consumers are now using cannabis at least once a day, which is huge, right? And those numbers have continued to grow quarter over quarter. So when we kind of calculate it all out in here, looking at the percentage of cannabis of Americans that are using cannabis, and the ones that are using cannabis, those that are daily users, we've got more than 11% of adults in the country using cannabis daily. That is a huge number. This is not a small niche, thing that is going on, a small niche, counterculture market in here by any stretch of the imagination. It's really going mainstream, but there's all these different consumer segments that are emerging. They're becoming more sophisticated, and becoming more sophisticated consumers gradually, and here as they get used to the idea of kind of walking into a store to buy their weed instead of getting it from a dealer or to getting it on the illicit market. This is becoming a consumer packaged goods industry, and so kind of the marketing really needs to kind of keep up from that lens.
Mm-hmm.
We don't see all of the same trends in Canada, which is interesting. In there, Canada has so many different restrictions on their markets, in there, that we haven't seen quite the same influx of new consumers. Most of the new consumers coming into the Canadian market right now are actually those that have, been purchasing from the illicit market and are now shifting, into, the regulated market. But we're not getting a whole lot of those newbies. We're not getting a whole lot of those, we're not getting a whole lot of the moms. We're not getting that same, cohort of like Gen Z women, and inspiring that kind of cultural change, in there. So, the women are still quite underrepresented in the Canadian market. And here, there's a lot of room to run there. So there's a lot of, it's interesting. There's a lot of room for Canadian market to run in terms of growth by being able to, target and see what's happened in the U.S., figure out how they can, leverage similar trends.
Yeah, I can see why you use the word interesting. That is super interesting. It's
Right.
like they've been legal longer, yet like you said, some of those cultural kind of movements, the adoption from females, it just hasn't really taken place. And I wonder if it's more so like America, it's in its nature, we're just louder, we're more promotional, I don't know, like I'm trying to
Yeah.
figure it out, maybe they're what is it, in the closet, the cannabis closet out there in Canada.
It's interesting. They actually have the highest rate of usage, at least at the time of legalization, they had the highest rate of usage of anywhere in the world. Really, because you think about the state, and we find in a lot of countries that, or you find in a lot of states, I should say, in the US, for example, that regardless of their political affiliations, if they are having more rural areas, they have long winters, there's, lots of, more spending more time in nature, these types of states, which are similar in a lot of ways to Canada, then you see, cannabis usage much higher in those states. So similarly in Canada, there are some cultural trends where, the adoption has been high to begin with, but it's not really growing, and it's still skewing male, and it's still kind of skewing towards that, that same initial market. They also have a lot of branding and marketing restrictions in the Canadian market. So they can't really, they can't make it look as cool. Right?
They can't put like a skull with flames on it and like
if you walk into a dispensary and or a retail outlet in Canada, you pick up a product and 3/4 of the package has to be warning labels, and then you get like a little icon in the corner, that's like the brand logo. Okay, that's not as exciting, right, as what you necessarily see in in the US. There's different kind of there's also restrictions on celebrities and how you can market. So even though it's fully federally legal, it's very tightly regulated, and all of those restrictions, as well as the restrictions on dosage limits in gummies and drinks, have a tendency of kind of limiting the market. But hopefully, we expect in Canada, the market does continue to grow at a strong pace. We see continued liberalization with additional keep calling them dispensaries. They don't call them dispensaries up there. Additional retailers,
coffee shops, smoke shops.
Just retailers, cannabis shops in there, but additional retailers opening up in Ontario and Quebec and a lot of these other provinces. So Ontario in particular has seen kind of an explosion in retailers that have opened up there. So that should help continue to kind of grow the market or grow accessibility, which is helping to deter people from going to the black market. And we'll see, maybe they will find a way to woo the ladies or the Gen Z consumers, to a greater extent in Canada as well.
Yeah, well, I can see why the branding and the marketing would be challenging with those restrictions. I mean, it's hard to differentiate yourself, right?
Yeah, so, exactly.
Hopefully that loosens up a bit. But I do want to end with this, Bethany, as we wrap up here. I think I asked you before to pull out your crystal ball, so I'll ask you to do it again one last time and tell us, what your main, predictions for cannabis and the CBD industry are for 2022. We're here at the start of March.
Yes. So as we look throughout 2022, I think in cannabis, we are expecting, we're seeing that kind of tale of two markets right now, with difficulty on the West Coast as brands are kind of competing against each other without a whole lot of growth opportunity from being stifled from a taxation lens. But I think where the real opportunities are, and where we see the greatest level of growth and the market to continue to flourish, is really in these newer markets, in these MSO dominated markets. Those MSOs are going to keep kind of picking up the best of the brands from the West, pumping those east into their brands. We expect to see some additional M&A activity, not at the high level that we saw early last year, but at those more regional levels, and kind of smaller levels, but those MSO expansion to really kind of penetrate, and a lot more focus on kind of refining and branding and and marketing and building up those kind of consumer facing brands and retailers. So that's I think a lot of the focus this year in the cannabis space, as those MSOs really start to actually go head to head and have to duke it out and compete with each other in these newer emerging markets. So in Canada, we're going to see a lot of focus on premium this year. I think and more focus on that. Live resin is exploding, like crazy. I think there's more of a focus, there on both sides of the border. Concentrates become more, becoming more popular. And, as consumers are, really kind of focusing on their spending priorities, there will be kind of some of that downward pressure on pricing while we see inflation everywhere else. So
Cannabis is always the outlier, it seems like,
it
in
is
every
never,
case.
never a dull moment. Never a dull
No,
moment. That's for sure.
absolutely. No, it's a great industry to be in with great people like yourself, Bethany. Really appreciate your time today, and all your insights and the great, research and data that you're producing at Brightfield Group. So, where can people find y'all's website and social media if they want to learn more?
Yeah, so you can check out our website at brightfieldgroup.com. We do have a great deal of freebie download reports if you'd like to check those out, and a great contact us. We'd love to hear from you if you want to reach out. We also have a presence on LinkedIn and Twitter as well.
Awesome. And we'll be sure to put those links in the description box for YouTube so people can find them there also. So, Bethany, thank you once again. Really appreciate your time. And yeah, let's have you on again in the near future as things continue to evolve. Never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment. Sounds great. Thanks, Kevin.
Yes, thank you. And thank you all for listening. Bye.